Okay, everyone, I'm about to broadcast this webinar live.
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Rashuni, and I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program. Thanks for joining the fourth installation of our Innovators, a virtual exchange of ideas series. Previously, we've spoken with innovators focused on coastal resilience and extreme weather, clean energy technology deployment, and food waste. And today, we're featuring innovators in sustainable finance. We have a few more sessions coming up later this summer, including one on carbon dioxide removal and utilization, and another on water. So be sure to keep an eye out for those. Today's conversation on sustainable finance will be moderated by Nancy McGaw, the Deputy Director of the Aspen Institute Business and Society Program. Nancy leads corporate programs designed to cultivate leaders and achieve the Business and Societies Program's mission of aligning businesses with long-term health and society. Before joining Aspen, she worked in corporate banking for almost 2 decades in Chicago, London, and New York. Nancy will lead a conversation between our two innovators, followed by some Q&A for those who tuned in. So please submit your questions now via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Welcome, Nancy.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks so much to you and your team at the Energy and Environment Program for inviting me to do this conversation today with 2 experts in this field of sustainable finance. So I'm going to give you the basics, and then they're going to tell you more in a few minutes about the innovative work that they're doing. I'm just waiting for a sec there, Susan. All right. So let me introduce Nat Kreamer, who has over a decade of advanced energy business and leadership experience. He's CEO of Advanced Energy Economy. We'll hear more about that. He also is a founder of Fair Trade Renew, where he invests in helping traditional industries adopt new technologies, which of course we know is hugely important these days, including the electric utilities, and helping move this transition to a more advanced energy solution. Nat is also a veteran, served for many years in the Navy in special forces in Afghanistan and was actually recognized by President Obama as a champion of change, as a veteran working in clean energy. So we look forward to hearing from Nat. Susan, great to have you here today too. Susan is the global head of sustainable finance, business, and innovation at S&P Global, and she'll tell us more about what S&P Global is and what she's working on. She has 20-some years in finance, including a couple of years spent living in Indonesia. She's actually, I think, originally from Australia. So she has a global perspective on sustainable finance. She joined S&P Global in 2015 in order to lead their global infrastructure practice. And she's moved on now to work in this sustainable finance business and innovation space, where she's responsible for S&P's global ratings on ESG. This is a very big topic these days. ESG, as the audience probably knows, is environment, social, and governance. I'd like to start with a discussion about what we're talking about. So what is sustainable finance? And I'm guessing that if we ask all of you who are there participating in this webinar from various locations, if I ask you to write a definition of what sustainable finance means to you, and we looked at all of these definitions, I'm sure we'd see quite a broad array. So for the purposes of getting us started here, I'd like to ask Susan and Nat how they define sustainable finance. And Susan, let me start with you. That's a tall order to begin with, but go ahead and take it away.
Well, Nancy, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here today. Sustainable finance is really a response in many ways to investors wanting to better understand the attributes of what they're investing in. So historically, we've looked at risk and return and tenor and the purpose of the investment. And what sustainable finance is really doing is it's taking a step further, and it's saying, let me understand better the environmental attributes of my investment, the social aspects, the sustainability aspects, and then when we get to ESG, environmental, social governance, it's taking a broader view of those things. So and historically, what has happened is that these attributes have been something that has been nominated by the person who's issuing the debt or the equity or the bond. But over time, as investors are looking for more granular detail, we're seeing more and more products develop in this space to give investors that understanding that they want.
Great, so thank you. A broader view of what you're actually investing in. That's probably I've shortchanged your better definition, but Nat, let me turn to you and ask what you would add to that description of sustainable finance.
I think the description of ESG investing in sustainable finance has very broadly been written. And I think that's a challenge of this question. A lot of it, so people will quote 13 trillion or thereabout of capital in the market that's doing ESG investing. A lot of it is screening out bad actions and saying, my capital is not supporting the following thing that is harming the environment, that is hurting society and is frankly, not a fair dealer in business. That is useful, but it is frankly, I don't think as useful as what I think of sustainable finance, which is taking an active position, independent of what the security type is, to actually drive change as opposed to a derivative impact. So let me give you examples. An example would be you're financing something that is going to reduce carbon, right? You're going to actually be able to finance low-income housing, for example. To me, that's real sustainable finance. The rest of it is being a good citizen. But sustainable finance, you've got to drive change.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because essentially one of the ways in which this whole industry is moving is to try and understand what the impact of the investment is and on the ground, and how it aligns, for example, with the Sustainable Development Goals that were articulated by the UN, or even at the corporate level, what is a corporate funding framework looking like in terms of its sustainability attributes, or its environmental, or the environmental, social and governance actions of the company.
Yep.
So is it fair to say then, before we move on, to ask you about the innovative work that each of you is doing, is that it's a new way to look at existing capital, debt and equity, all kinds of capital, and it's also thinking about new sources of capital. So it's both? Nat, would you say that's the case?
I think that's right. I think there is capital that is going into businesses that's existing sources, and those businesses are having, and their primary business is to have, an impact that is better for our society or economy, et cetera, right? Environment. That capital, it has externality benefits that we're all enjoying. It also has often reduced risk. Although it should also be making better products and expanding margin. I mean, a lot of it, I'll just make this as an aside, a lot of ESG thinking has been about risk management. And I think when you do that, you really lose the opportunity. So, it should be, can I drive revenue? Because when you drive a lot of revenue and profit, you drive a lot of change, especially if you're delivering a primary benefit. So I think there's plenty of capital that's already existing that does that, and people just need to understand how it does that. And then the second category is absolutely that we need capital formation that is basically able to get behind change that's new. Generally, the way the capital structure works or the business models are not brand new. They tend to be, an innovation that is taking something we've done in other parts of the economy or in other periods of time and applying it to a new technology set or to a new problem. Right, around our environment, around governance, around our society. But people need to be able to make that analogy and say, oh, I'm taking these sorts of risks at these sorts of rewards. And it's not that different than what has happened at massive scale, somewhere else. It's just around this trend, right? And that's where I'm investing.
Great. So with a better sense of what we're really talking about, in the sustainable finance space. Susan, tell us more about your work. Where are your priorities? How are you facilitating sustainable finance? And what's innovative about the work you're doing?
Sure. So at S&P Global Ratings, we have been innovating in sustainable finance quite significantly over the last few years. I mean, our first role, and the role that we're most well known for, is in credit ratings, where we're looking at the relative risk of default of a bond financing instrument. And in that case, we're looking at to what extent do ESG factors impact on that relative risk, and we are providing more transparency to investors to call out those factors across all of the ratings that we are doing. But as we spoke to investors, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of demand for a deeper understanding as to the attributes of an investment, aside from the credit risk. So there are two areas where we've been innovating over the last few years. One is in the green space. And we developed a green evaluation which looks at the environmental attributes of a financing. And it's carried out by our credit analysts and our sustainable finance team, who understand what is going on with a particular project and a particular financing from a sector and environmental perspective. And what they do is they look at the net environmental impact of any financing. So they look at what is the cost of construction, operation and decommissioning of the project. They look at the environmental benefit of it, and then they place it in a relative context by looking at in what country is this project or financing located, and how much is it actually going to decarbonize the grid relative to if it was located in another country. So the whole evaluation allows an investor to compare a wind farm in France with a coal to gas switching in the US with a wind farm in Texas, and look at which of these projects is going to have the highest impact in a decarbonisation sense, or from the perspective of improvement in water quality or land use, for example. And so it's that deeper understanding that that we've been trying to achieve with this particular product in response to investor requests. And then from an ESG perspective, what we were being asked by investors was to essentially take a deeper dive into environmental, social and governance, and look at the extent to which a company's environmental, social and governance aspects go beyond the impact on credit, and the extent to which, though, the aspects of their behaviour with respect to their stakeholders can impact back on them over the medium to longer term as well as the short term. So in that context, we have launched our ESG evaluation just over a year ago, which looks at the current profile of the company and its longer term preparedness for risks and opportunities of the future. It's very forward looking. It takes data and takes a quantitative view, but then it overlays the analyst and sustainable finance experts' knowledge of the company, the sector, the region, to provide a more holistic, forward-looking view of how well a company is positioned, again, relative to others, relative to its sector, relative to other companies across the world, relative to its region.
Thank you.
Two areas where we've really focused on providing a greater level of transparency and analytical insight to investors so they can make decisions with the benefit of that information as well.
So it seems like just a few years ago, it really, even if someone were inclined to do this analysis, the tools wouldn't have been there. And S&P Global is really trying to provide the tools to make that possible.
Yeah, well, I think we've seen the quality of data and reporting and disclosure improve quite significantly over time. And as the market has become more sophisticated, investors want to find out more information, more capital is flowing into ESG related funds and indexes and funds that are focused on specific environmental, social and governance objectives. And so it's really in response to that we have tried to overlay the benefit of the deep understanding that our 1,600 analysts around the world have about companies, about sectors. They talk to investors all the time. They have an understanding of what investors are looking for. And our analytical team developed these methodologies to implement these products. I led that analytical team through that development period. Now I've moved to a commercial role where I sit on the commercial side of our business and are charged with building up our ESG business.
I think
that's so helpful. That's one particular and critical slice on this innovation question. Nat, I think you have quite a different role, which is, it's so interesting to get the two of you on the screen at the same time, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think the value, just to dovetail on what Susan's saying, and then I'll transition, the value of doing the homework in a really detailed way is incredible. There is no shortcut if you're going to have capital driving change. What historically was happening in the US market, and still happens in a lot of cases, is a company gets a very long questionnaire that is so generic, right? And then a numerical rating comes out of that. And then a fund, maybe it's someone like Calvert here in San Francisco, says, oh, they have a good rating, and you mutual fund buyer should buy me, right? And that was the marketing. That attempt to quantify is incredibly imprecise and really doesn't drive any behavior. And so, it was effectively an attempt for quantitative perfection that always was wrong. And there is no substitute for actually doing deep analysis in these areas to really understand, because it's really complex. And I think doing that deep analysis in the homework is really the first step, no matter where you sit, whether you're a big asset allocator or you're thinking about credit, or you think like in the way I do, which is how do I make a product, right? Or how do I deliver a financing service? Or how do I invest in a business that is going to take, a clean technology and transform a commodity market that is currently dirty, and is going to have a great carbon impact, or a great land water, or other environmental attributes, as well as drive a lot of profit and have a tremendous amount of growth and have long-term recurring cash flows, et cetera. So you have to do the same level of homework. And so my perspective is, you do that homework, you find an opportunity, and you try to invest early stage. So I did that as an entrepreneur in founding a company called Sunrun. It's a bit in the news this week. It bought its near-peer competitor, Vivint Solar. Now, it owns 500,000 homes in the United States. It's doing, somewhere on the order of a gigawatt of residential solar. And when we started that company, people looked at us and said, impossible to finance, right? Solar is too expensive. So you got to get in early, but not too early. And we did. We created finance products, and we created a capital market in a lot of ways that drove the distributed solar industry, which is now becoming the distributed energy resource industry. And so I think that's been a great success story. But the level of homework you had to do early was really, really, really important. And so that's, in some ways, that's a pattern in my commercial life that I repeat. But I think it is also true to really do that homework, in the context of advanced energy economy, or before when I chaired the U.S. Solar Industry Association. You have to understand the real economics and the real details and the market structures and what's going on in a specific industry to be able to know whether that's going to be a great investment. You can't do it in broad generalizations, which I think, that's simple for an asset allocator. They need to have a partner like S&P to be able to do that, or they got to do the homework themselves.
Yeah, this is not easy work. We can certainly hear that. We want to talk a little bit, keeping an eye on the clock, because we want to have some questions from the audience as well. But in my work with innovators in business over a decade plus, I've always been so interested in what it was that triggered a commitment on the part of the innovator to work in this space, because what you've both described sounds very complex. There have got to be days when you think, gosh, this is just really hard to do. There are other ways to make a living. So Susan, I'm going to come back to you. What was it that, and then we can go back to the sustainable finance space, but I'm really curious, what was it about your experience that took you in this direction?
Well, it's interesting, actually. I mean, I have spent 20 years working on infrastructure transactions globally before I joined S&P, and so I've always really thought about environmental, social, and governance and sustainability as something that is fundamental to business strategy. Because if you have an infrastructure transaction, which is generally, they're large projects, they take a long time to put together, a lot of approvals needed, a lot of permits, takes a long time to get the financing in place. If you haven't really thought about all your stakeholders, whether it be regulators or consumers or employees or the local community, chances are your project is not going to be as successful as it otherwise could be, and it may not even happen. And so it was really bringing that thinking around into a more formalized structure, which is what really ESG is. ESG is really a framework to think about what are the externalities that could at some point impact on your business in a positive or negative way, and how do they align with your business strategy? How do your ESG policies feed into your business strategy? And so it was really that approach. that has spurred my interest in it. And that's one of the reasons, one of the aspects of our approach that I think is quite differentiated is that we do sit down in our ESG evaluation and talk with management and speak with a board member and really talk about how ESG is aligned with business strategy. And again, that is something companies want to articulate their strategic direction as well as their achievements in terms of what metrics they've been able to achieve. And investors also want to understand that business strategy context as well.
Right. Without that connection, it's superfluous, really, in many ways. Nat, how about you? How did your life path take you into the work that you're now doing?
Well, two ways. One, I started dirty and then I got clean and then I got conviction. So I started dirty, which is I started in the coal group of a very large innovative energy company where I learned the energy business and great and terrible lessons about ESG, which was Enron, which has famous and infamous alumnus who've gone on to do a lot of things, some in prison and some not. But it was a good lesson to get as a really young person in energy finance of what you should and should not do to make a company. And in that company, I went from the coal team to the clean tech team. And everyone said to me, you should go into the natural gas team or the power team. You're ruining your career. And I used to joke for a long time, especially in the early days of Sunrun, that the jury was out. I may have ruined my career, right? Like I should have stayed in fossil fuels. So I got cleaned up. And I was also in the military and in the reserves. And I got recalled to go to Afghanistan. I got stopped one day by a guy named Colonel Hartman, and he paused me in the hall, actually standing with Admiral McChrystal, who was, or Admiral McCraven, who is now famous, and said, "Hey, Kreamer, you know energy. If we spent all this money on clean energy, which is like $500 billion at the time that we'd already spent, would we be over here fighting?" Because we all understood the economics of why we were in the Middle East and what was happening and what was going on. And I came back and I basically said, give me a day, sir. I'll give you an answer. And I came back and I said, no. There was no way we would be here. And that was based on the existing technology curve we had been at it. So really, in a lot of ways, going to Afghanistan gave me conviction. I had the idea to start Sunrun before doing that. I came home, and I think really going through a war gives you an asymmetrical sense of risk. And so it prompts you to be an entrepreneur and drive change.
So you both made really compelling cases for sustainable finance from very different perspectives. So what's holding us back? Nat, what do you think? Why aren't we all just forging ahead, or maybe we are? Are there impediments to moving forward with this? And I'm going to keep muting because I think I've got landscaping noise in the background, and I don't want to distract.
I think a tremendous amount of capital has already mobilized and recognized and really led the way and said, look, we realize that we have to invest in this way, and this is going to be the future. So I think that's a really positive, and I can take a lot of optimism from that. And when I meet with, the head of energy investing for a large global fund, and we talk about his plane for a little bit, and then we talk about how he's never doing another fossil fuel fund ever again, and it's all going to be clean tech. The world has changed. So that's really positive. The second is, I think that where we are caught up, and I think this is one of the reasons I've been so active in policy, and one of the reasons I love being on the team and running Advanced Energy Economy, is we're really transforming policies so that we can expand these markets. And the area that I think you'll most often hear from investors and corporate leaders is, there is something that either protecting incumbents who are bad actors and creating externalities, or what I'm delivering, both in economic value and in societal value, is being thwarted because of an antiquated market structure, a lack of understanding by policymakers, legislators, regulators. And examples of that I can give you, are a long list. But I think if you think about the role of policy, there's three big things to take away. One is, please don't do any harm to the motivation of entrepreneurs, scientists who are making the technology, and engineers, and investors are going to invest in it to drive these changes, especially in the energy market. Example of doing harm is today the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is on an activist bent to basically change a set of rules that are free marketing rules effectively, with guidelines that basically are trying to box out new technologies that have an absolute value advantage to the wholesale energy markets. And those new technologies are clean technologies. And so, that's an example of, regulators doing harm, right? The second is, if you have policy that's going to drive, that's really going to, make sure that that policy is designed for fast evolution and change and scalability of ESG innovation in a lot of ways, and make sure that it's long-term. That gives surety to investors. And the third one, and I think this is an area that a lot of people jump right to, which is price externalities, right? If you can price externalities in a marketplace, we can then finance behind that and innovate behind it. There are a lot of instances in which it's complicated to place those externalities, but you have people who basically fight politically so that doesn't happen. We are all experiencing those externalities, right? We're experiencing them in the health crisis today. Miami Beach is flooding something like 100 days a year, right? Like, you don't have to talk to people, and people think of Florida and say, do they believe in climate change down there? I think the people who own a lot of valuable property definitely do. So I think people are experiencing those externalities and say, what do I do about it? The role of government is really to make sure in this way in the market, we don't have a tragedy of the commons, and that we have a fair way to manage our economy through this rapid change.
Well, thank you for that. We could have another session or two, or a month-long discussion about public policy, and even this specific question about how do we get our arms around these externalities and get people on board with being willing to deal with them. Susan, what would you say about what's holding us back? Or if you want to throw in something you're really hopeful about, I invite you to do that too.
Well, I think one of the very interesting aspects of the situation we're in now is that we now have a much clearer understanding of what S or social is. Because of the coronavirus, because of the focus that we've had over the last month or two on particularly on inequality. And I think prior to that, people were a little bit unclear as to what the social piece really was. And so that's positive. And we've seen companies really lean in to this, not all of them, but a lot of them, and really focus on the importance of these issues and understand how stakeholders think about these issues and the importance that they have with respect to reputation. So I think that's been a very interesting thing. The second thing that's happened over the last period of time has really been the Business Roundtable's restatement of the purpose of the corporation, where the Business Roundtable actually went back to a definition they had in the 80s and said the purpose of the corporation is not just fiduciary duty towards shareholders, it's broader, and it includes all stakeholders, so communities, employees, consumers, governments, and so on. And so again, that broader definition is shifting the discussion. So we're really at this point, I think, where we have a step up in understanding, a step up in the level of focus from investors. We're seeing a lot of capital go into ESG and sustainability strategies globally at the moment, in relative to non-sustainability focused areas. And really, to Nat's point, given the very deep capital markets that we have in this country, I mean, they're an enormous strength. They're very agile. There's so much more that can be done. And so ideally, we're going to get to some point in the future where, for every financing, there's an understanding of the sustainability or ESG attributes of that financing. And it's something that is part of part of the considerations that an investor takes into account. That we're not there yet, but we've certainly moved a long way.
Yeah, I think the license to operate, right, is no longer a winner take all, and I owe nothing to anyone. So that's basically a rapacious attitude that I think corporate leaders and investors recognizing that and setting that tone that we have to be a steward of the world we live in, the markets and economies that we're in, and we need to make decisions with those principles in mind. That starts to drive the leadership. So you start saying these things we will do and these things we won't do. I was at an ESG session with a retired vice chair of Citibank at the Stanford Directors College some years ago, and they gave a case study. And the case study is, where do you put the factory? Right, and it was like, put in the inner city in a developed country, which happens to be your market, and create jobs, right? And fire environmental regulations. Right, there was shut down one, and I think the last one was move it to the uber low cost labor location with no environmental regulations somewhere in Southeast Asia. Right, and this vice chairman of Citi, it's like, that's what you got to do, maximize shareholder profits, which was really that old mentality. And I said, this is pre-Trump election, I said, look, you're in some ways, you're this globalist when it comes to how you make your profits, and you tell me the folks in that location need jobs too, but you're hollowing out the locality in which you operated by moving those jobs offshore. You're going to shut that factory down in 4 years. You're going to move it. And you're going to tell the market it's a one-time write-off that I moved that factory, right? And I'm going to do it again, right? And so you're arbing jurisdictions for a period of time, and polluting the environment as you go, and hollowing out your customer base locally. I said, but when you get in really big trouble, you call guys like me to come pick you up in the United States Navy. I said, look, if you want a functioning economy and a functioning society, you can't look at it the way you're looking at it. And so he took umbrage with the fact that I told him, he was effectively a globalist with his profits and a nationalist with his ass. But he needed to think more holistically about his investing and how he thought about it. And I think that debate between the two of us in the room pretty much epitomized, am I going to create jobs, make sure that they're good, take care of the local economy, fire environmental regulations, and what am I doing? Let's move it to that inner city, which ostensibly would have been Detroit, right? In the way the case described it, let's put the factory in Detroit, right? And we're not going to move it to Bangladesh. And, they're encompassed it.
So before we get Greg back on in just a minute to bring in some questions from the audience, Susan, you described the Business Roundtable as a reflection of real change in business thinking. In the Business and Society program where I work, we hope that's the case, but there's still a huge amount of work to do. And Nat, you described a scenario, admittedly, a number of years ago where people had a very different view. Just in a couple words, each of you just comment before Greg comes back on, are you optimistic that these attitudes in business have really changed about the responsibility toward the planet and people? Susan, what do you think?
I don't think you can hire a next generation of people who are highly talented and incredibly smart to come work for your company and help you drive the next set of growth if you aren't. You don't have to change, but I just think, the one thing that you can't, there's lots of capital, right? Invention and innovation is where value gets created, and that requires human capital and intelligence, and you just can't get it if you don't think like this. You're welcome not to, right? And then I'll enjoy beating you.
Susan, what would you say?
What I'd say is the average life of a company on the S&P 500 in the 50s was 70 years. Today it's 15, possibly even less now. And so companies are faced with technological change, disruption, changes in consumer sentiment, changes in community views. And the reality is, if they don't take account of those factors, then, I think the capacity to have a long-term sustainable business that's the question mark that you have to have. I mean, companies have to continue to think about what these issues are and how things are changing.
This is terminal value, in a magnified way.
Well, talent acquisition and retention and survivability are two pretty compelling reasons. Greg, you want to come on and see if anybody from the audience has questions?
Sure. It looks like we've got a couple of questions. First one is, are there any new investment vehicles or strategies that are trying to finance things that would have a positive social impact, but are maybe too risky for grants, but too low in returns to attract regular financing?
Well, in the energy space, one of the challenges we have, one of the thing I'm most excited about, but I'm also concerned about, is the electrification of transportation. You can run an electric vehicle today at 80% less than the cost of oil. It's half as much to maintain it. Those put real dollars back in people's pockets who have stagnant real wages and increasing debt loads, right? So like if you want to do something, figure out how to get them an electric car, right? It's good for the planet, puts dollars back in folks' pockets. The challenge is we don't have enough public charging infrastructure. And so people will pay a lot for convenience when they have inconvenience. And it's a chicken and the egg financing problem. And I think that's an area where, frankly, we need government investment to jumpstart that market. And I'll give you an example. We had a housing problem post World War II, where loans sat on banks' balance sheets, and that bank had local deposits, and it couldn't turn its balance sheet fast enough to make a new loan, right? And so we said, hey, you know what? We're going to create a government entity, and it did what it was supposed to do at that time really, really well. Fannie and Freddie, and they said, we'll buy those loans off your balance sheet. You'll recycle we'll give you the private local knowledge. You'll recycle your balance sheet. You'll put more money back in the economy. People build more houses, right? Like Levittown and Long Island, or not like Levittown, or Columbia, Maryland, or not like Columbia, Maryland. We put a lot of people in homes, right? And we needed to do that. We need to make a leap of faith bet around public charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. And that leap of faith bet, which I think is the way you described that investment proposition to me, was who the heck is going to make this leap of faith bet, the thing that we know we ought to do. And that's an example of, that's where public credit, meaning off the government balance sheet with private capital in partnership, makes a great example. I've written something recently called the American Climate Trust, which looks at doing something very similar and uses public credit and private capital markets to take on exactly those challenges.
Susan, do you want to add anything? Another question is, do you believe that the markets can reinvent themselves fast enough to avoid catastrophic climate change?
There's a big one.
Yeah. The $1 trillion question.
Susan?
You should have taken the first one.
I'll fumble around on it, so I'm willing to do it.
I think that what is interesting is if you look at what is happening in the US at the moment, there are I think at last count something like 27 or 28 utilities who had signed up for a zero carbon goal. And there is really quite extensive investment that is going into utility scale solar, utility scale wind, battery storage, and so on. So I think, and I think that one of the things that we have seen is that infrastructure companies generally and utilities also are, they're long-term investors. They are looking. They're all running long-term scenarios, looking at what the impact of climate is and looking at what the potential regulatory environment that they could be facing down the track is. And they're taking that into account in their investment decision-making. So there's always this question of pace, but directionally, it is reasonably clear that investment is happening. And I have been asking in some of the webinars that I've been doing lately, I've been asking these companies, whether or not the current volatility in oil prices is changing that view. And the answer so far is no, it doesn't seem to be. Now, we'll see what happens at the end of the day. But we do seem to be moving in a direction where these investments are being made, and it's really now a question of how quickly they're going to be made.
Yeah, no question that new investments are exactly what Susan said. You know, we've worked with Pinnacle West, Arizona Power Sources parent company at AEE, to do something that hadn't been done in the country. Historically, utilities had received a lot of external pressure to go 100% clean, or it was already happening in their market, and they were, you know, kind of like guns, germs, and steel. They were beneficiaries of their situation, like California, for example. In Arizona, the utility had been very protectionist of its fossil assets and its position. And it said, look, instead of getting into a political fight, instead of being told to do it by others, you know, new CEO came in, Jeff Glunder, and said, look, I can see this as the future. I can see that I can drive a lot of value for my community and my shareholders by making this change. And then I've got the most cheap solar power in the country. How can I use that cheap energy to drive economic growth to Phoenix, right? Like, let me think about that broader definition of corporate leadership. And he said, look, Nat, you used to be on the other side and fight us on solar policy. Like, I go to Arizona and they break my heart, right? It's the sunniest place in the country, and policy was against us because I was effectively, and he said, look, let's do this differently. Let's figure out how to do this big vision together. And then we'll roll that out, right? Which is what good product managers do, say what product is going to really work for everybody. So at AEE, we engaged our member companies and did that in a strategy down to tactics, investments in businesses. Some of it's easy stuff like utility scale. Some of it's hard, like long duration storage in that marketplace. But we have done that over a year. And in the course of that year, you know, they joined that list of announcing that they would make 100% commitment. And I think, you know, Susan hit it, which is pace, right? The legacy, what's in the legacy fleets and how quickly will people give those up? I think policy has a role to play in helping the energy sector in doing that.
So, and that actually brings, that goes right to the next question, which is, are there any policies, legislative or otherwise, that could be implemented to move this narrative along for businesses and to make you know, ESG investing easier, more simple, more effective?
Well, I think we have a challenge, which is, you know, at AEE, we've been very bipartisan. And when I was SEA chair, we moved to be bipartisan in the way we operated and acted. I think one of the challenges today, but look, at the state level, because people, I think at the state level, are more accountable, they can't print money, and they have to be more responsive here in the United States to their citizens. You see more bipartisan support around, hey, I'm going to have jobs, I have economic growth, this is one of the fastest growing sectors, huge infrastructure investment, money back in my customer's pocket, right? If I'm a Republican, I'm a conservationist in the Teddy Roosevelt tradition. If I'm a Democrat, I care about carbon and climate, right? But they're effectively fungible in the way they think about these policies. Where this is a football is only in DC. And it's a football in DC because of the money ball, the amount of dollars that are flowing in from legacy industries. Now, the amount of dollars that are flowing into Washington in support from legacy fossil industries just absolutely dwarfs what clean energy can do, even though clean energy's gotten a lot bigger, right? That's number one. And number two, unfortunately, you agree with me or disagree with me, but our DC politics has not become about what's best for the country. It's become about who gets to be in charge, right? So the way you get a deal done, my perspective is you got to give people something they can win on, both claim victory on. You know, one of the policies, and I have a derivative of it in this American Climate Trust, but I take the idea and change it a little bit, was actually created by former Secretary of State Jim Baker, which was a decarbon dividend, right? Instead of cap and trade or cap and tax, we'll create an incentive that basically shifts wealth. And part of that is going to go back directly to citizens in the country. Well, that becomes a free market mechanism. It's a lot like the 1990 Clean Air Act of the United States, except we're going to put dollars back in Americans' pockets. That becomes something that you can get a bipartisan deal done. You know, I think if you had you didn't have basically the Moneyball politics boxing us out. The risk right now, is, in my view, is that we don't look for a deal that gets everybody to win and that's massive scale, and so we fail. That's what's happened with the Green Deal, right? And it was easy to kill. And the risk for the Republicans are that they lose their next generation who's going to be affected by this, and they know it.
So
I think what's happening in Europe is very interesting, because what you are seeing over there is a lot of policy and a lot of regulation that is really impacting behaviour of investors. There's a lot of disclosure required of investors, and as well as corporates, and so that's pretty interesting, and it's going to be interesting to see the extent to which that starts to impact on what happens here, because to the extent that you're actually going to be doing transactions in Europe out of the US, then presumably those regulations are going to impact you. I think we've also, obviously, as Nate said, got a lot of state regulation and policy making that's happening. So I think it's going to be something that we'll just see how things evolve. Obviously, policy is extremely meaningful in terms of the direction it takes companies in. But as I said earlier, what we're really seeing in many instances is, these investments are happening anyway.
Yeah, and I think there's if you want a really interesting state level political perspective, I would look to the actions that's happened recently in Virginia, right, which is not a market where people would have thought. We at AEE worked with the administration, the legislative leadership, and developed a bill that had broad support called the Virginia Clean Economy Act. And 3 years ago, if you'd asked somebody, will Virginia have 100% clean RPS, and will Virginia basically decide it's going to decarbonize its energy sector, people would have told you Dominion's got the capital locked up, including my uncle, who spent 38 years there and was the chairman of the Utilities and Commerce Committee, which regulated utilities. He said, look, they got 28 lobbyists on the Hill, Nathaniel, every day. How many of you got? I'm like, well, every once in a while I got one, right, at that time. You never have done it. And bills passed, change happening, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the economics aren't there, it's gone. But if you want a really good read, go read the Texas Monthly story about the oil patch this week. And I think it'll give you a great perspective of this change that's happening at the state level outside of the federal. And I think Susan's absolutely right. Europe has its own challenges, but in terms of doing the right thing politically and from a policy perspective, it's doing a tremendous amount right.
So last question, and Susan, you touched on this a little bit earlier in the discussion, but how has the current COVID situation affected the drive for clean energy, and where do you see the next, say 4 to 6 months in terms of clean energy buying, ESG investing? What do you predict for the future?
Yeah. Well, obviously, the next 6 months is pretty uncertain, but what we're certainly seeing, and many companies are focusing on very immediate needs, but we're certainly not seeing a reduction in interest in ESG at the moment. In fact, we're seeing it stepping up, and so it's obviously harder for companies to make plans at the moment in terms of future prices and the fundamental underlying assumptions. But in terms of the commitments that they've already made, the discussions they're having, I think people, the other thing that is quite important in this whole discussion is the long term versus the short term. And there seems to also have been a shift in recognition that you can't just focus on the short term. You need to take the medium term and the long term into account as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I can tell you that in one of my businesses, we saw, and this is, I think, a great example given the economic turmoil, you know, going into COVID and lockdown here in the United States, this is financing solar for small businesses and consumers. And it's a white label platform. So it's working through hundreds of companies that are selling solar every day and storage. Consumers clearly didn't buy anything, right? Like there was people didn't know how to sell to them. A couple things happened that were amazing. One, people said, well, I'm going to be at home and my economic fortune is not as rosy as it was before. I'm going to buy power. And, you know, maybe I heard about solar and I know I can save money, but I just like, you know, I have a long list of things to do. And, you know, I got a PTA meeting, whatever it is, right? Like there are many other things in people's mind that they want to do. Now it's like, I got to save on my bills. Oh, I'm going to buy power. Yeah, I'll take that call. And, you know, the companies are out selling the product, you know, change their selling strategy. You know, one company created a robot that would show up at your house and like take measurements, right? Using AI and robotics. That was pretty amazing. People started using a lot more Zoom. Guess what? March sales and April sales, 40%, right? It was really rolling off where it was. May, slow. June, huge demand. And in 2007 and 2008, when we started Sunrun, people said to us as we're going into the economic crisis, you know, how's this going to work, right? We said, we think people want power, they want to pay less. And unless you plan to live without power, right, there's a lot of demand. And the fundamental economics of all this clean technology going into renewables specifically is semiconductors and power electronics and software. And we all know that gets cheaper faster. And so you're basically talking about extraction, which is wildly expensive, right? And transportation over long distances, competing against, you know, effectively the kind of technology that we're talking on here. I just don't see people saying, yeah, I'm going to go make an investment in in oil. And you know, I think I'm going to get out of it at a big multiple 10 years from now, because they're like, look, I'm going to lay this volatility. And then I've got this technology thing that's happening that's already beating me. And we're within 3 years, the battery cost curve, putting that EV at first cost being the same and OpEx being way lower. And when that happens, I think you're going to see it be like cell phone because it's a better car to drive.
Well, with that, I'll turn back over to Nancy to close us out. Nancy?
Okay, thanks. Well, we've got about 2 minutes. I hope that those of you who joined us on this webinar have a somewhat different, more nuanced view on sustainable finance. That would be great. And what's possible in this space. Finance seems such an arcane and complicated industry, but I think what Susan and Nat have shared today is how critical it is for what so many of us care deeply about. And just in that spirit of innovation in this space, I'd just like to invite Nat and Susan to think about what's on the horizon for them. What's the innovative work that they're really excited about? And we'll close with that note. Susan, do you want to start? What are you looking out onto?
I'm very excited about what we're doing at S&P Global, because we have ESG is a strategic focus across our whole company. We have recently bought an ESG data and ratings business, which gives us 20 years of deep data and benchmark information, which we're integrating across our indices business, our data content business, and into our ESG evaluation, and really looking at building out more quality information for investors right across the spectrum. And also, I think just, you know, working to provide an independent way in which companies' whole business strategy and ESG story is articulated to investors. So that, I think that's pretty exciting, actually, and it's
Really, yeah. Thanks for that. Nat, what would you say?
The electrification with cheap renewables.
Electrification with cheaper what?
Cheap renewables. It's changing the power industry. It's changing the transportation industry. It will change the built environment. And then it's enabling us to really run an automated economy that allows us to bring manufacturing back to a lot of places. And really, lastly, it helps us solve tough problems. Like it's driving into the money the ability to get water out of the ground that we couldn't get before and clean it up. And that there's just tremendous application of that broad electrification with cheap renewables that has massive sustainable value and massive investment potential globally.
Oh, great. Those are terrific thoughts to wind up this conversation with. Greg, thanks to you and your team for putting this together, and to Susan and Nat for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thanks.